Good morning, everyone. I've got another phone to unbox today. What we have here is the PinePhone by Pine64. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up. We'll take a look at it, and then I'll talk a bit about how this compares to other open source type phones that are available. So before we open this up, this is a PinePhone Community Edition with post-market OS pre-installed. And what Pine64 is selling today is the PinePhone Beta Edition. This thing's from about 6 months ago, so I guess this was a Alpha Edition. That's what Community Edition is if what they're selling now is Beta. So opening this thing up, we have a phone in here, and it's packaged in a reasonable plastic thing. Let me go ahead and pull this off. And we have a phone. I'll go ahead and pull the screen protector off. And so what we have here is a not terribly exciting phone. It's got this post-market OS edition label on the back. It says powered by Linux. We've got a camera. We've got some buttons on the side. We've got a USB-C plug. So it looks like a phone. If you look real carefully here, you can see that this is the kind of phone that has a notch at the top. I'm not sure why they decided that was a good idea, but that's what's going on. So size comparisons. Here's the PinePhone. We can compare it to the Librem 5. The PinePhone is a little bit taller, maybe a little bit wider, and noticeably thinner than the Librem 5. Librem 5 is the thickest phone ever, I think, but that doesn't make this thing super thick. It's just sort of typical. And when I say typical, another thing that I'll compare it to here is a OnePlus One. This is sort of a old mid-range to low-end flagship style phone, and it's almost the same size as the OnePlus One in a case. Let me go ahead and pull the case off the OnePlus One. And when I do that, we can see, again, it's almost the same size, but the PinePhone is a little bit thicker than this, I don't know, what is this, 5 years old now, relatively old phone. I don't have any phones to compare it to that aren't almost exactly the same size, but this is a sort of 6-inch display. Let's go ahead and take a look at what else is in this box. We have some notes on how to get started. We have a user manual, well, a quick start guide. We have a charging cable, this looks like. There's got to be a way to get in here. There isn't, it's just you rip it open. So it is a USB A to C charging cable. We have a SIM card adapter thing right there. We have a USB docking thing with a HDMI out, a pair of USB ports, and an Ethernet port. And the reason we have this is because they sell two different editions of the two different versions of the PinePhone. There is a standard edition, which costs $150 and has 2 gigs of RAM and 2 gigs of RAM and 16 gigs of storage. They sell that for $150. And then they have the Convergence edition, which comes with this docking thing, but also comes with 3 gigs of RAM and 32 gigs of storage. So the specs are a little bit better. And this is the higher end one. And they sell the Convergence edition for $200. So unless you're really trying to save money, it's probably worth getting the Convergence edition just for the slightly bumped up specs, because 2 gigs of RAM is sort of marginal for anything nowadays. 3 gigs of RAM is still sort of marginal, but it's a little bit better. So here's the specs of this phone. We've got an all-winner A64 system on a chip, which gives us a quad-core Cortex-A53 processor and a Mali 400 MP2 GPU. At least for the Convergence edition, which is what I've got, we've got 3 gigs of RAM and 32 gigs of storage. We've got a just under 6-inch 720p screen, and we have a 3000 milliamp hour battery, all for $200. So compared to other phones, This is nowhere near as powerful as sort of a modern flagship phone that you would get from a major brand for $1,000. But compared to something that you could get for the same price point, this is not quite as good, but comparable. The comparable phone that I was looking at was the Samsung Galaxy A12, which comes for $200 from T-Mobile. And it has a 8-core, big little processor on it. So it has 4 big cores, which are going to be a little bit more powerful than the Cortex A53 in here. And then it's got 4 little cores, which are going to be lower power, but not necessarily contribute to sort of raw compute performance. It's got 3 gigs, 32 gigs, so it's pretty comparable to this. This is not a bad deal compared to other phones in the same price bracket. The next obvious comparison is the PinePhone to the Librem 5. The goals of these two phones are pretty similar. They both want to be able to run mainline Linux with open source drivers and a complete stack of open source applications, which will allow users to have a mobile phone without having to worry about Google producing Android or Apple producing iOS or any of that. You can have a community-produced operating system with complete open source from the ground up so that it can all be audited and you can modify it or you can have someone modify it, all the normal advantages of an open source system. Now, the specs on these two devices are pretty similar. The Librem 5 also has a system on a chip that has a quad-core Cortex A53 processor in it, although it's a little faster. It also has a mobile-style GPU, although it's a little faster. And these other specs are pretty similar for the Librem 5. The one huge difference is the price. The Librem 5 costs $800, which means that you could get 4 PinePhones for the price of one Librem 5. And the reason for that price difference, in addition to some detail about mechanically how this thing works over here, is a philosophy difference in how these two devices were designed. On the Librem 5, the designers were committed to having this have complete open source support from day one at launch, whereas the PinePhone developers were willing to make some more compromises in order to get themselves into a more mainstream and therefore less expensive system on a chip. The system on a chip in the Librem 5 is not a phone or even a mobile system on a chip. It's an embedded system on a chip intended for like cars. Whereas this all-winner system on a chip, it's not a complete mainstream phone system on a chip, but it is a mainstream inexpensive tablet system on a chip. And so the production costs are such that it can be sold in bulk, and Pine64 is able to sell these phones pretty cheaply. In hindsight, the slightly riskier strategy taken by Pine64 of going with a more mainstream system on a chip worked out great. There are excellent open source driver support for the PinePhone, arguably like incrementally better than on the Librem 5 because of the like trickery that people have been able to do with running open source firmware on the modem. That turns out to not be legal to distribute, so it's going to be difficult for everyone to take advantage of that, but there's no driver open sourceness advantage to the Librem 5. The one advantage that the Librem 5 hardware does still have is long-term hardware availability guarantees. Purism will be able to produce a Librem 5 on newly produced silicon in like 2027, whereas the all-winner A64 system on a chip may not be available at that point. Whether or not that turns out to matter, we'll see. All right, advantages for the PinePhone. First big advantage is the price. Being able to get four PinePhones for the price of the Librem 5 makes it tempting to get 2 PinePhones for half the price of the Librem 5. The potential even bigger advantage is that if you order a PinePhone now, you'll probably get it. They've been delivering these pretty consistently, whereas if you ordered a Librem 5 right now, you'd be lucky to get it by the middle of next year. I think they will eventually ship all the orders. They have shipped at least one. I have this one here, but the number of people who have them is super small. It hasn't been shipping nearly as quickly as they need to be shipping it to make it possible to use. You can't use stuff that you can't get. Another advantage to the PinePhone is that it has more well-supported operating system options. Because people can actually get the PinePhone, developers have been porting Linux distributions to it, and there's at least 6 decent Linux distributions available for the PinePhone. The Librem 5 has some advantages too. First, it's got slightly better specs. The specs aren't enough better to make up for the price difference or the availability difference, but they are slightly better. The design is slightly more focused on serviceability and the ability to swap out components. You can easily swap out the modem, you can easily swap out the Wi-Fi card. The Wi-Fi card is even on a standard M.2 thing. That's neat. The Librem 5 USA exists. The Librem 5 USA is a version of the Librem 5 that is manufactured in the United States. They aren't manufacturing all the components in the United States because the fabrication resources aren't necessarily available, but they're doing the final assembly in the United States. And that means that if you're worried about supply chain issues, and especially if you are a government contractor for the United States government, the Librem 5 USA offers something that is just basically completely unavailable in other phone options. So that is a neat, unique thing. And if you really want a Librem 5, they have been shipping the Librem 5 USAs a little bit faster. The problem is L5 USA is $2,000. And so you could get 10 PinePhones for the price of one Librem 5 USA. And regardless of any benefits to the Librem 5, if you don't care about that supply chain issue, then I would suggest getting like 4 PinePhones for less than half the price. The PinePhone is pretty good. As I mentioned, the system on a chip may be supported for longer. Another advantage, PinePhone had more well-supported operating systems, but it's possible that Pure OS on the Librem 5 is better supported because it's officially supported by paid full-time developers at Purism. And that is a useful thing for making sure that there is consistent support and reliable security updates and that sort of thing. Although the community distributions on the PinePhone, as long as you put some effort into picking a reasonable distribution, the support should be pretty good. Community Linux distributions have, on PC, been the best operating systems for decades. One more relevant comparison are the kill switches. Both of these devices have kill switches. On the Librem 5, you can see here that there are 3. One to turn off the cellular modem, one to turn off Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, and then one to turn off the camera and microphone. And these are hardware switches. So if you flip these switches, it doesn't matter what software is running on the device. It doesn't matter if you have a virus or whatever. If these switches are turned off, software is not accessing those devices. So that is a useful security thing, especially the cellular kill switch, because this removes power from the cellular modem, and that means that your phone is not going to be connecting to cell towers and reporting your location all the time, which is pretty neat from a privacy perspective. The fact that we all carry tracking devices, if we carry traditional cell phones with us all the time, that report our location anytime they are on, or maybe even when they're off, cellular kill switch is cool. PinePhone has them too. Let's see if we can find them. They are not on the outside. So this is a disadvantage to the PinePhone compared to the Librem 5. If we want to get at those kill switches, they are right here. Now, you'll note that there are more kill switches. And while we have this open, there are more kill switches, which means that we have a little bit more granularity. I don't remember what all of them do, but it's the sort of thing where they may have a separate kill switch for the microphone versus the camera. I think the granularity of the Librem 5 kill switches is fine, but I think the main difference between the way the kill switches are implemented is that having them on the outside makes them much more accessible. Having to pop the back off your phone constantly isn't great. But while we have this phone open, there's a couple other neat things in here. We've got a removable battery. It's possible to reliably get replacement batteries for this, which is great. And then the other super neat thing in here are these pins. So these pins let us do something that we can't do with the Librem 5, and that is get smart cases that do stuff. So those pins allow data communication with a case. And so the case could have like a better camera, or I think you could put an extended battery, or all kinds of stuff that makes this a especially flexible platform because of those expansion pins. Let's It's not too hard to get the case on and off. If you really wanted to occasionally flip those switches, you could do it. The next comparison is how does the PinePhone compare to an Android device with no Google on it? So Android has some innate advantages of maturity and support that it's going to take an awful lot of effort to catch up with on the PinePhone. Specifically, Android is going to provide a better phone experience out of the box. If you want to make phone calls, you want to send text messages, Android is just going to do a better job. Those things are working pretty well on the PinePhone. The PinePhone has okay carrier support for carriers in the United States. I think if you drop this in on T-Mobile, it will just work. I'm gonna try to test it later on Verizon. That's not gonna make it into this video, but PinePhone can make calls, send text messages, but not 100% reliably. Whereas if you get yourself an Android device, that stuff just works. Android can run Android apps, and nowadays that's pretty important. There are a lot of situations where the only way to accomplish something easily is through an Android app. The example that I come across most frequently is depositing checks into my bank account. My choices are use my bank's Android app, take a picture of the check and then have it upload, or like sign it and drive to the bank and deposit it in an ATM or with a human. And so if you have Android apps that you need to use, you're largely stuck with Android at this point. Although there are some Android versions that may run on the PinePhone, but at that point, the advantages of the PinePhone are sort of nullified by running Android. And the other possibility on the PinePhone is that we may be able to run an Android emulator inside the normal Linux operating system, which may start to solve those problems in the future. But if you want to run Android apps, running them on Android is going to be the easiest way to do that for the foreseeable future. Now, the big difference between Android, which is a Linux-based operating system, and the more conventional Linux-type operating systems that run on the PinePhone or the Librem 5 is the way applications work. So on Android, we have Android permissions. And the idea of Android permissions is that we want to be able to make it so that we can run untrusted apps from a commercial app store without having to constantly worry that running those untrusted apps is going to be a security and privacy nightmare. Permissions mean apps can't access data from other programs, apps can only access the network or the camera or other standard interfaces if we give them appropriate permissions. Android has those permissions. The traditional Linux operating systems for something like the PinePhone do not have those permissions. The advantage of not having those permissions is that you can do normal computer things easily, like saving a file in one app and then opening it in another. That just works on Linux. On Android, that can be a nightmare, especially if you don't have the permissions exactly right to make it convenient. So an advantage to Android is that we can run those untrusted apps with some level of safety. Whether or not you want to run untrusted apps on your phone at all is debatable, but Android and iOS have a good answer to allowing at least slightly untrusted apps, whereas you don't want to run any untrusted apps without doing careful manual sandboxing on a Linux device. So that raises the question, why would we want to run the Linux device? And one answer is that this PinePhone costs $200. Getting a good phone that will support a custom Google-free Android ROM and then getting it installed and all that, you really can't do it for $200. Like, you might be able to find the phone for $180 used, but then you have to make sure you got exactly the correct model. You may have to deal with them shipping a different model from what they claimed. It's all annoying. I would rate a decent Google free Android phone as being around $300 is where I would price that. So the PinePhone's cheaper. The lack of Android style permissions makes it easier to do traditional computing tasks, like having a daemon running in the background, or having two applications talk to each other directly, or modifying the drivers to do something convenient, having an application make a driver reconfiguration to fix something. So you've got quite a bit more flexibility by not having that permission model and by trusting your apps. And as the Linux phones progress, they should add things like Android emulation that allow the Linux phones to be the best of both worlds. Complete open source drivers allow for more tinkering possibilities that are difficult with the sort of blob drivers that are typical on an Android device. So the PinePhone and the Librem 5 run mainline Linux, which means you can just go in, edit the source code, and recompile and run the new kernel. You could even contribute your patch upstream. Now, exactly what that lets you do is hard to come up with sort of broadly convincing examples, but when you run into things like discovering that the driver for your Bluetooth thing doesn't support Bluetooth serial, and you know how to fix that, but you're on an Android device with a blob Bluetooth driver so you can't, it's super frustrating. With open source drivers, you don't have that problem. Another advantage of the open source drivers is that future software releases are going to continue supporting this basically forever. We constantly see the closed source driver Android phones just fall off in support. There's a new version of Android, there aren't new updated versions of the driver, and so even a phone like this, which is a OnePlus One, which had excellent custom ROM support when it first came out, you can't run an up-to-date version of Lineage OS on this, you can't run Graphene OS, it's just too old and the driver support is no longer available, and so the community can no longer support the device. The PinePhone open source drivers, mainline Linux drivers, should be supported in 10 years, no problem. The PinePhone supports Convergence. That means we can plug it into a keyboard, mouse, monitor, network cable, and use it as a desktop PC, assuming that we have appropriate software running on it that supports that. I've tested Convergence on the Librem 5, it works okay. Haven't tested Convergence on the PinePhone. Might be fun to do. But that's an advantage that's significantly more difficult to simulate on Android, because Android really is a mobile-only operating system. The PinePhone itself has the obvious advantages compared to any Android device of having a replaceable battery and having hardware kill switches to turn off network connectivity, camera, microphone, etc. That's a great feature if you are interested in being able to have that sort of direct control over what your device is doing and whether or not it's connecting to the cellular network or Wi-Fi networks, etc. All right, let's try booting this. I think before we can boot it, we have to pop it open and pull a tab out from the battery. So let's pop it open and see if there's a tab protecting the battery from it. Yep, right here. So I'll pull this tape off, throw the battery back in, pop it closed, and we'll go ahead and long press the button. This thing has an old version of Post-Market OS on it. That's not that exciting. I'll definitely be swapping that out for something more interesting pretty soon, but let's see what we got. So there's the boot screen. In fact, I ended up getting 2 of these Community Edition PinePhones. The first one was an Ubuntu Touch version, which I'm not super excited about. That's not a fan of Ubuntu Touch as an operating system. And then this was the second version they released, which was Post-Market OS, which is a little bit more exciting. At least it's a proper Linux. But looks like we're installing Post-Market OS version 2005. Definitely old. I bet there's a 21 version by now. But this is for Pine64 PinePhone. Press continue. Let's go ahead and put in a pin 0000. Oh, it needs to be 5 digits. 0 0 0 0 0 0. Continue. I would like to enable SSH. Keyboard is knocking off pretty easily, so let's go ahead and put our SSH username as nat. SSH password is test. Full disk encryption I'm going to disable just because I don't want to deal with it, but it's neat that this supports So this is going to run for a little while, and I'm going to go turn off that dehumidifier. That took about 2 minutes to install, and then it rebooted. And, oh, it's blinking. There's a cursor blinking in the corner. The cursor went away. There we go, finally booted. It says, welcome to your new post-market OS installation. Here are some instructions on how to do stuff. Let's see if we can connect to Wi-Fi. So this is Phosh, which is the same UI that the Librem 5 was using with PureOS. So if we connect to Wi-Fi, same sort of annoyance that PureOS has with Phosh, which is that when you launch an application, nothing happens for a second and then it runs. That makes common sense for a desktop OS, but it would be nice if they had a splash screen, full screen. All right, so my password is also goat. Come on, A. Connect. We're supposedly connected to Wi-Fi, so let's go ahead and pull up Firefox and just confirm that this can do stuff on Wi-Fi. I expect Firefox to be kind of slow to launch. Again, a full screen Firefox loading window would be spectacular here. Oh, welcome to Post-Market OS. This is the desktop version of Firefox, but with a mobile-friendly configuration. Oh, this is the desktop version of Firefox. That's amazing. The mobile version of Firefox has been annoying me. I may have to make this phone my daily driver. So open bst.org. Songs. Let's go ahead and download an MP3. Speakers are not terrible. So that is the PinePhone running post-market OS from last year. And let me know if you have any questions, and I may be back with more stuff on this PinePhone with comparisons to some of the other devices I've looked at recently too. So should you buy a PinePhone? If you have $200, yeah, you should buy a PinePhone. There's no reason not to. This is super inexpensive. It'll run a whole variety of Linux distributions, including sort of mainline kernel, traditional style Linux distributions, and a whole bunch of weird stuff like WebOS that otherwise had died, but the software still existed, and this is a place it can run. So if you're interested in this sort of thing at all, yeah, you should definitely buy a PinePhone. Thanks for watching. Go ahead and click on the link down in the description and follow my RSS feed. That way you won't miss anything I post in the future. Have a wonderful day.